Nice to see everyone on screen. I'm inclined to wait another minute or two at least to see if some other people log on. So uh, I'd encourage you to just feel into the body, try to relax a little bit, bodily feeling, melt any places of felt tension, release attention from being caught by thoughts that we've been in up till now, and just with an easy presence, relaxing the body, we can be for a few moments as we see if some other people log on. So hi again, and I'll start now. My name's Elon. Nice to see all of you for the Sunday night talk here. Some people I recognize names and faces on screen as old friends and acquaintances. Some people are new to me, so I'm wondering, um, these Sunday night talks are meant for anyone, but almost in particular, they're meant perhaps for newcomers who are just interested in hearing about teachings. Is anyone new, hasn't previously taken courses at Nyingma Institute or something like this? Great, well, welcome. Um, you might hear one of my dogs in the background. Actually, I'm going to take 30 seconds right now and see if I can move him to my wife. And just everyone kind of, again, relax the body, feel in. I'll be right back here. Okay, maybe happier doggy, and we're ready for a talk and exchange. Um, so again, welcome to Sunday evening at Nyingma Institute, wherever you are. I happen to be on the East Coast. I know many of you are on the West Coast, and I see some people in the meditation, one of the meditation rooms of Nyingma Institute. So nice to see that. Um, the way that this evening will go is I'll make some remarks for a while, 30, 35 minutes, and then leave time for exchange, discussion for a good 25 minutes or so. And then at the hour, anyone, well, of course, you're welcome to come and go as you please, but we'll officially end at the hour. And I'll stay on if anyone on the Zoom, if anyone wants to keep chatting. Sometimes that's the case. So we don't have to end the conversation if there's still things that people want to discuss. Okay, so um, one of the first things I'd like to say is Nyingma Institute has an incredibly rich offering of courses. And in a couple of weeks, I think around October 20th, a new term starts, so a whole new set of courses of different kinds. And they're really worth checking out. I put into the chat the link. So if you look in the chat, you can find the link to the courses and see the new set of courses. And So you'll see there's a range of offerings from a gentle type of meditative bodily based practice that we call Kumye Tibetan yoga. But this is, if you haven't done this before, it's different than an athletically oriented type of yoga that you might associate with yoga at a yoga studio. This is far more meditative, and it lays the ground for deeper other sorts. I shouldn't say deeper. It lays the ground for all kinds of meditation practice. And it in itself, this Kumne yoga practice, is an incredibly deep practice. Um, so that's one of the ongoing wonderful offerings. And then there's various courses in traditional Buddhist texts, in meditation, just presented for a contemporary audience, not necessarily based on a traditional text. And you can see more there. And I wanted to mention especially that someone that I had the privilege of meeting a while ago, a person named Kenpo Kalsang, is going to be a guest teacher at Nyingma Institute starting in a few weeks. And that's a very special opportunity, especially if people have taken maybe some classes previously, but even if you haven't, and if you wanted to sign up for his class. So Kenpo Kalsang is a Tibetan Buddhist monk, and his background is quite extraordinary. I could talk on and on about him, but I'll just say he has a really rich, wonderful background, and he has like the equivalent of a sort of PhD, but in actual Buddhist training, not in a Western university, um, coupled with deep practice for decades and decades. And he's been here in the States for quite a while, for over a year now. And his English just gets better every day, and it was already good over a year ago. So I'm out on the East Coast. I'm in Massachusetts, and he just spent a year at Harvard, studying at Harvard, where I used to teach. So anyway, taking courses from him is a special opportunity, but the whole faculty at Nyingma Institute, it just has this wealth of offerings. So uh, I had the privilege of doing a lot of my learning early on at Nyingma Institute in the 1990s, and getting some good grounding in work practice as a volunteer there, and then in meditation practice through various programs and retreats that they would run through the 1990s. So Nyingma Institute, even though I live across the country, it's very dear to my heart. Um, and I'm very happy to be able to occasionally give these talks. Appreciate being invited. Um, for those of you who are brand new, Nyingma Institute is informed by Buddhist tradition, this long-standing tradition that has many variations, and Buddhist tradition goes back at least 2,500 years in our world. And the particular type of Buddhism that Nyingma Institute is a part of, there are two types of Buddhism, we could say, in today's world. One way to look at it. There's Mahayana Buddhism, and there's a different type called Theravada Buddhism. And they have a lot in common, but they also have some distinctions. And so Nyingma Institute is part of Mahayana Buddhism, the sort of Buddhism you find all through Tibetan regions. Buddhism developed in India and greater South Asia, India, Nepal, surrounding regions originally, and then spread all over Asia. So Mahayana Buddhism is the type of Buddhism you'd also find throughout all of East Asia, China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam. That's all Mahayana Buddhism. Um, and then within Mahayana Buddhism, coming from India, transmitted later into Tibet, and now to America, there are many different traditions, and the particular tradition that Nyingma Institute is part of is called the Nyingma tradition, which really means the originals, the older ones, meaning this is the tradition that was first brought from India into Tibet when Buddhism first moved from India into Tibet. So it's called like the original or the ancient or the old tradition. Because then later there were other waves of bringing teachings from India into Tibet. So those became the newer traditions. So that just to give you a little kind of context. Um, so, and then a tiny bit of background about myself. I'm a longtime student of these traditions, as I partly mentioned. And then I also, for my career, I study these traditions, right? And so I read in the languages and I teach Buddhism at universities. And these days I'm situated at Brandeis University. Um, and previously I had a 7-year visiting stint at Harvard, which is right nearby to where I live. So, um, but I'd like to talk really about practical matters, right? And for those of you who have already been involved or interested in Buddhism in some way, or those of you who might get interested at some point, once you dip into almost any reading about Buddhism, pretty quickly you're going to run into this term renunciation. Renunciation. And partly in this talk tonight, I'd like to shed some light on this topic or term of renunciation because I've learned through the years that there's quite a bit of confusion generally in our culture among people interested in Buddhism regarding renunciation and what the tradition is really talking about when we're talking using that term. And so the first thing I want to say is that term, renunciation, that's an English translation, obviously, and it's most indebted to Christianity. That's a Christian monastic term of Christian monks in ancient days would renounce. They would give up certain things in life and go and live a monastic life. And then as people are translating Buddhism, they're often importing these Christian terms that we have in English and using them for the Buddhist terms. But this can actually create confusion. And the confusion is not just academic confusion. This confusion, as I hope I'll show you, it can really get in our way for what we want to accomplish in our lives as practitioners to try to positively transform our lives and move toward freedom in our daily lives. If we're holding a sort of confusion about how the path works, then that can trip us up or slow us down. And so this issue about what are we really talking about with renunciation is one of these places where working with students a lot at the university and having lots of friends who are longtime practitioners for decades, I have seen this is a tricky issue, right? So hopefully we'll clear it up a little bit. That's the aim. So the title of my talk, The Resolve for Genuine Freedom, that title, The Resolve for Genuine Freedom, is one way to think of it. It's a different translation of what we're really talking about when we're using this term renunciation, right? That instead of saying renunciation, we could be thinking in terms of the resolve for genuine freedom. And then I'd like to unpack a little what that might mean. So, of course, there's lots of variation in how we use language and how we take on culture from the past, be it Western culture or strands of Christianity or whatever the case may be. But some of the connotations that we have from renunciation is some sort of sense of like gritting our teeth and pushing through to give up stuff that we really like, to force ourselves to do something that's really hard and kind of yucky because we're supposed to do it and it's supposed to be good for us, right? So a lot of like drudgery. Now I have to do this to be like sort of a good spiritual person. That's not what the Buddhist terms mean. When we're talking about the Buddhist terms that get translated as renunciation, that's not what they mean. And later I'll probably share screen and I'll show you some of the Buddhist terms. But uh, I'll say one and then later I'll show them to you on screen. But the key Buddhist term here is nissarana in Sanskrit, a key language that was used in India in the birthplace of Buddhism. So this word nissarana, it has kind of two sorts of connotations. It has a connotation of, on the one hand, seeing through and becoming disenchanted with parts of experience that we've investigated and we've found to be unhelpful, unbeneficial, counterproductive, detrimental. So when we look at experience carefully, again and again, moment by moment, inwardly in our daily life, then some clear seeing develops. And as clear seeing, as far as what's going on in our experience develops, just from introspecting, from looking inward and seeing, oh, here's this agitation, or here's this anxiety, or here's this insecurity arising, or here's this distractedness, or here's this irritability, or just oversensitivity, or whatever the case may be, right? As we start to see these facets of our experience, which are human, that we all have them, this is what Buddhism wants to address, is how we can find more freedom given the fact that we have these sorts of difficult tendencies, right? As we start to see these tendencies more, then as we start to see through what is really helpful for us and what isn't helpful for us, then we become disillusioned or disenchanted with continuing to pursue what's not beneficial for us, what's not helpful, right? So that sort of disillusionment with what is meaningless or futile or harmful, it's a result of experiential observation and experiential knowledge, experiential seeing, right? So there's a sort of turning away, but it's not a turning away because we decide, oh boy, that's really wonderful, and I would really like to do that, but somebody told me I'm not supposed to do that. It's not that. It's we see, ooh, as I keep getting agitated, it upsets myself and it upsets the people around me. Um, and it's not peaceful and it's not happy and it's not how I want to live. And as we start to see that more clearly and then learn methods for living in a different way, for defusing that kind of agitation, we turn away from it, right? Not because somebody told us we had to, but because we've seen in our experience that's what's part of living a freer and better, more wholesome life. Okay. So that's one of the connotations, is this disenchantment, disillusionment with what's not beneficial based on clear seeing. And then another connotation of the same term, this nisarana, is a different sort of movement, which is a positive movement toward a freedom that we begin to glimpse. And we can start to see it exemplified and embodied in people who have been practicing the path well for quite a while. Then we meet inspiring people, like some of the faculty that you'd meet at the Nyingma Institute. Um, uh, and so through that kind of inspiring example, but then also through seeing our own experience and seeing how we can start to defuse the dense patterns that entrap us, and we can start to allow lighter, brighter, freer ways of being to emerge in our everyday experience. We start to see, oh, deeper freedom is really possible. And so this wish to move toward the deepest possible freedom, toward this positive goal, that's part of this nisarana, right? And this term, I'll put it in the chat, and then later I can show you various terms, but just put that word in the chat so you can see the word I'm talking about. And that's a Sanskrit is a type of language. In ancient South Asia, India and surrounding regions. Okay. And then the Tibetans will translate all of these words from India into Tibetan language. So I can show you the Tibetan words later, perhaps. But the key Tibetan translation of this word is nejong, nejong. And I'll put just the pronunciation. Tibetan is funny. If you try to you can write it the way it's pronounced. Um, but that doesn't exactly capture um, the actual lettering. So I'm going to write the way it's pronounced. Sorry, I'm battling the autocorrect. Doesn't recognize Tibetan words. So in Tibetan, this word nisarana, they translate it as nejung. They worked with great Indian masters when Indian Buddhism was brought into Tibet, starting really in the 700s, and started the Nyingma tradition in Tibet. And so the Tibetans and the Indian masters worked closely together to think deeply about the meanings of these key terms. So when they translated from Sanskrit into Tibetan, they were trying to capture an underlying meaning. They weren't always just going for the literal surface of the word. So it's actually helpful to think for a moment about this nejung, this Tibetan translation of this Sanskrit word. The Tibetan translation actually has like two components, ne and jung. Like that's, I sort of wrote it as two words if you look in the chat. And the first part, the ne, the N-G-E-S, sort of sounds like, that's like a type of certainty. It's like a definiteness. There's a certainty there. There's like uh, a determination in the sense that you determine something with certainty. Okay. And then jung means like to make it occur, make it happen, or something that arises or happens, right? So um, really what this is about is seeing what's unproductive, seeing what's meaningless, seeing what we thought was going to bring us happiness, but then once we investigate more closely, we realize, no, that ain't going to bring us happiness. What I was doing, that doesn't work. It doesn't matter the variation I try. I think uh, drinking lots of Coca-Cola didn't bring me happiness, but if I would drink Pepsi, that'll do it. Then I think, no, 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 that doesn't work. So now I got to drink Sprite. And this may seem like a dumb example, but it's kind of what we often do in all the aspects of our lives. This car is not good enough, so I need a different car. This partner is not good enough, so I need a better partner, one without all these other faults, right? Um, uh, you know, uh, and so there's a sort of definiteness of seeing through what is not going to bring us happiness and what is. And then the Jung part is this making it happen, of getting out of those unproductive ways of living, getting out of those patterns, right? So like one way this is sometimes translated as is like a definite emergence or a definite movement from what? Out of the muck toward freedom, a movement out of the muck toward freedom, right? Um, but based on this like certainty that, okay, we've looked at it, we've tested it out over weeks and months and years, we've checked it out experientially from every angle, we've felt how doing this and that, following this pattern, and these sorts of disturbing states don't bring us what we want. And then there's a definiteness of, okay, we have to go a different way. So that's like the Tibetan translation of this term. Okay, so you see it's a little bit different than just using the word renunciation, right? It's quite a different thing that we're talking about. Um, so uh, now I want to talk about more of what's involved in this whole, not just the Buddhist term, but all the kind of associated ideas around it. Because what this term, this nissarana, is talking about, um, sarana, I'll back up one step. Going back, if you look in the chat to that Sanskrit word, like the original term from India, there's actually two parts, N-I-H, like ni or nis, and sarana. It's like two words put together. And sarana really means stream or current. Stream, current, like a flow. And here it really means like the current, the whirlpool, and going with the flow of kind of what ordinary unexamined life is all about. just going with the way that we've been conditioned unthinkingly. Okay. That's like sarana. That's going with the stream. That's flowing with the current of kind of unexamined everyday life. And then the nih, the NIH part at the beginning, that means out of, going from. So it's again, it's this movement out of just flowing along with the stream uh, for no reason, you know. Just because everybody thinks that binging on Netflix or endlessly scrolling through Instagram or trying to put up some ideal image on Facebook and pretend like there's some sort of ideal life of we did this and we did that, just because some people may think or want to think that somehow that's going to bring some sort of genuine happiness doesn't mean that that's going to bring some genuine happiness, right? So if that sort of thing is an example of just flowing with the everyday current of our society, you know, um, getting all riled up about every standpoint that we want to take. Not that we shouldn't take standpoints, but do we have to get like really upset? You know, or can we engage the standpoints that we passionately believe in a different way from the heart, but without being like violently angry, right? And being unable to talk to our neighbors or something because their political views or religious views or something like this are so different than ours, for example. If those are examples of just flowing with the current of everyday life, nisarana is getting out of that, right? It's going against the ordinary current by seeing that no, there's a deeper way to live. There's a more authentic way to live. So that there's a movement toward an authentic being that we're not fully in touch with. We may glimpse it, and that's why we feel some longing or dissatisfaction, because something in us knows a more authentic way of being is possible, but we haven't really known exactly how to actualize that, exactly how to make that happen fully. And that is one way of talking about what Buddhism is all about. I mean, what the courses at Nyingma Institute are all about is to discover our genuine positive potential and be able to bring it out. And so the Buddhist terminology or the Buddhist religion, in a sense, is extraneous. It's a means, it's a vehicle, right? But what we're after is freedom. We're not after like putting on any kinds of trappings or walking around with a card saying, I'm a Buddhist, or I'm a Hindu, or I'm a Jew, or I'm a Christian. It's not going to get us very far, right? Um, so this kind of not going just with the ordinary flow is part of this understanding. Um, all right, so I want to talk about a few like related larger aspects of this term that would relate more to our everyday lives, let's say, and some of the confusions that I was speaking to at the start of this talk. So I want to underscore right now first that what we're talking about at this point, or what I'm trying to talk about at this point, is really about our own freedom. Okay, like our individual freedom, an individual wish to not be caught in disturbing states and patterns inwardly and in our interpersonal life, and instead to find a more genuine freedom that then we can live not only inwardly, but in our life with other people. Okay. So I'm not at this point, just to be clear, I'm not talking all about what sometimes is called the Bodhisattva path, the path in Mahayana Buddhism of selflessly trying to serve and benefit all other beings and so forth. And I'm going to come to that later, but I want to make this clear that at this point, this discussion is centering around the wish for our own freedom, meaning as individuals, okay? Because I feel that this key point often gets overlooked. It gets short shrift in many Buddhist books and in many kinds of teachings. And there's a reason why it gets short shrift. It shouldn't. It's this wish for our own freedom to have like a genuine caring about ourselves, a soft, empathetic gentleness, a deep, you could call it a self-compassion, right? This is a term that psychologists are using nowadays. They kind of modified from Buddhism. Buddhists don't use compassion in that way. When Buddhists talk about compassion, they're almost always talking about our attitude toward others. And the reason is that until recently, like, maybe until the early 1900s, let's say, or late 1800s, some of the psychological problems and issues that are rampant in our culture were very rare or unheard of in almost all cultures around the world. And one of these aspects is um, that it was just understood and taken for granted as a healthy part of being a human being in most cultures around the world, certainly in Buddhist cultures. It was taken to be just you, an obvious, um, almost intrinsic part of being a human, that we're going to care for our own well-being as individuals. We're going to care about ourselves, and that's a good thing, right? That almost doesn't need to be taught. Like it's just so much a part of the culture and what it is to be human, that to like take care of ourselves, to want the best for ourselves, to not want to harm ourselves. Okay, that this was just so much part of the cultural worldview throughout Buddhist Asia for so many centuries that the teachings didn't need to emphasize that. And so like there's an anecdote that at a conference many, many years ago, decades ago, when the Dalai Lama, who is a prominent figure within Tibetan Buddhism, um, was engaged in a talk with, he'd come to America, and he hadn't been here very long, and he was engaged in a talk with Westerners, and people were talking to him about the problems of people hating themselves and wanting to hurt themselves, and not caring about themselves. He couldn't understand at first. He kept saying to his translator, "You're translating wrong what they're saying. Like you're telling me," his translators, listening to the English and then talking to him in Tibetan. And the Dalai Lama is saying, "You're telling me these people are saying they don't like themselves. They don't care about themselves." And he's saying, "That's absurd. That's ridiculous. Who doesn't like themselves?" Like, and it took quite a while in that first exchange for the translator to the Dalai Lama to get clear, no, these people are saying they really have trouble. They have negative self-images. They don't like themselves. So the reason I spend time talking about this is the Buddhist teachings don't emphasize this so much explicitly because it's so taken for granted that we are going to have a genuine deep wish for our own well-being. And this causes some confusion among modern Westerners when they meet Buddhist teachings. Oftentimes, it appears to me, and others whom I know, because when the Buddhist tradition is talking about this wish for freedom, this nissarana from the Sanskrit, or this nejung from the Tibetan, this definite wish to be free from all of the disturbances and move toward freedom, there is an emotional aspect that is built into that is assumed. And I don't want us to miss it. The emotional aspect is caring, like a deep caring about ourselves, right? And we, in our culture, for various reasons, many of us, we're all different, but some of us, and maybe even many of us, certainly I've run into this, we can have obstacles in this. Like if we really try to send unconditional, total caring to ourselves, we can run up against all these self-judgments of, oh, but you don't deserve this sort of like unconditional acceptance and caring, or you're not good enough. If only you'd improve and develop these qualities, X, Y, Z, then you'd be deserving of this sort of like love and care. we sometimes have trouble just sending unconditional love and care to ourselves. But these Buddhist traditions sort of assume that we're already doing that. So that's why I'm trying to make it explicit that built into this whole notion of getting out of the muck of our unproductive patterning and moving toward freedom is this emotional component of unconditional deep care for ourselves. Okay. And part of the place where this can get tripped up or go awry in a number of ways I've observed among contemporary practitioners interested in Buddhism. One way is that you see in Mahayana Buddhism, we eventually, with enough training, we embrace and celebrate a certain ideal that we would call the ideal of the Bodhisattva. I'll just put that word in real quick into the chat. And the Bodhisattva is a person who is dedicated not only to alleviating their own distress and their own problems, but really wants to understand what is at the root of distress in the minds of everyone and how to alleviate that distress at the deepest level from everyone. And for that, all kinds of skill and knowledge is needed, deep knowledge of our being and how our bodies and minds work. And eventually, in the Buddhist understanding, a bodhisattva progresses on a path of deeper and deeper love, caring, learning, understanding, action in the world among people and animals and all beings. And eventually a bodhisattva becomes what's called awakened or enlightened. And at that point, the bodhisattva is not a bodhisattva anymore. He, she, or they is then an awakened being, a Buddha. And that's where we get the word Buddhism from. A Buddha is an awakened being, right? It's the culmination of this path of a bodhisattva. And so again, bodhisattva has this wish or aspiration to benefit all beings in the deepest way possible, to lead them to a lasting freedom within their minds. And Buddhism insists this is possible. This is the whole rationale and reason for Mahayana Buddhism, is to try to accomplish this, or at least help people move in that sort of a direction. So what you've heard about the Bodhisattva ideal, there is this vast vision of caring about all beings, what we might call altruism, where instead of being self-centered, there's this caring toward others. And so sometimes, because if we are trapped and entangled in self-images that are not a true reflection of what we really are. So if we're overly involved in a sense of self that is false in terms of what we actually are and what our relationship with everyone else in the whole world is, if we're caught in those sorts of ideas of self and we have a intense attachment to our image of ourself and protecting ourself, that's actually going to get in the way not only of our own freedom and happiness, but certainly of being able to help and care about and benefit others. So there's a lot of talk on the Bodhisattva path about, say, giving up self-cherishing, giving up the self-centered attitude. This is very important. I mean, I love these practices. I find them incredibly inspiring. In no way am I intending to criticize them. But what I want to point out is many people, they hear these kinds of teachings. Oh, the Bodhisattva is supposed to not care about themselves. They're only supposed to care about other people. And then, based on cultural conditioning that tells us we're not good enough, we, for this or that reason, ought to feel guilty, we should judge ourselves or castigate ourselves or sort of put ourselves down, we're not worthy of feeling joy, or we're not allowed to feel deep joy. When other people are suffering, how can we feel joy? These kinds of ideas that circulate throughout our cultural conditioning, people latch onto those consciously or unconsciously. And then they say, oh, but the Bodhisattva path says you're only supposed to care about others. And then they use that idea, knowingly or unknowingly, as a justification for not sending enough love to themselves. They can use this idea of, I'm only supposed to care about others, as a way of not actually caring about themselves and touching into their own heart and their own pain, um, and just saying, oh, no, 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 I'm not supposed to care about myself at all. That's not the Buddhist message. That's not the message of the path. As I said before, these traditions take for granted that we're caring about ourselves. So when we hear messages of we're supposed to give up self-cherishing, we're supposed to give up obsessive self-centeredness that impedes our own happiness. We care about ourselves, and a wrong or diluted sense of uh, self-preoccupation gets in the way of our own actual happiness. So giving up that self-preoccupation is actually happiness for us and caring about ourselves. It's not saying we're not allowed to feel joy, et cetera, et cetera. So this is one of the ways that people go astray, right? They don't really want to have this first step of deeply sending love to themselves, which is crucial. Um, and then another way that people go astray, and I'll be briefer here so that we have time for discussion. Another way that people sometimes go astray is higher teachings in Buddhism. Once we investigate, we start to see, according to the Buddhist tradition, that we can observe directly in our experience once we stabilize our attention and we learn how to look inwardly at what's happening in our thoughts, emotions, memories, anticipations. As we learn to look, we can see more clearly. As we see more clearly, we can see the sense of self that we thought was solid, that we built our identity on, of I've got to protect this particular sense of self, um, doesn't have, according to these Buddhist understandings, the solidity that we thought it had. And again, this isn't a belief. This is something we're meant to see for ourselves with our own attention, looking inwardly at our own experience, based on meditative training that refines our attention, creates a suitable instrument for looking with our attention. These are all things that you would learn at courses at Nyingma Institute, right? Um, this is what I try to study, the same things that the courses are doing at Nyingma Institute. Um, so this leads to Buddhist understandings that really our real condition is egolessness, that we're really egoless. Or sometimes you'll run into English translations that say there's no self. The truth about the self is there's no self. These translations need clarification, but yes, it's certainly the case that Buddhist traditions are pointing out that what we thought was some sort of identity that we needed to protect doesn't need protection. Because it's not what we really are, that we're actually an openness, that good news, it doesn't need that kind of protection. So when people run into these teachings about no self or egolessness, again, they sort of tend to go in the same direction as when they hear teachings about the bodhisattva and the altruism of the bodhisattva. They tend to say, oh, there's no self, so I'm wrong to care about myself. There's no ego, so wishing for my own freedom, obviously that's, ego-centered. So I'm not allowed to do that. But that's a huge mistake. It's a huge misunderstanding. Um, uh, because again, these teachings assume we already deeply care about ourselves. And when we're seeing through an image that is false, it's because we care about ourselves and we want freedom. Now we can have discussion and so on about, well, now what do we mean by ourselves? But Buddhism isn't denying that, look, here we are, we're beings, right? And whatever sort of self we have, that's always been the case. And so whatever isn't real, that's always not been real. And we're here, we're beings. So Buddhism's not saying like, we're not here, we don't feel, we're here, we feel, we can be free. That part of ourselves that's here, we're beings, we can be free. That's what Buddhism wants to lead toward freedom, right? So to think, oh, there's no ego, so it's wrong to like be concerned with my own happiness and freedom is the worst sort of confusion. All right. So these are all confusions that are associated with this term renunciation and what it really means to turn away from distress. Um, I'm going to wrap up so that we have time for discussion. And thanks for your attention. Let me glance at my notes and just see if quickly there are any points that I haven't touched on that I think I want to really briefly just throw out there. Um, well, one brief point is that what we're turning away from are the inner causes of disturbance and distress, the inner causes of frustration. So, what outer objects are we turning away from? Are we turning away from our intimate partners, our sexual partners, be they whatever, casual partners or husbands, wives, whatever the case may be? No. Are we turning away from having children? No. Um, I'm married. I have two daughters. I've got two dogs. I've got two cats. Have a job, et cetera, et cetera. Are we turning away from being able to go out to dinner with our friends? No. So we're turning away from the inner causes of our disturbance. We're turning away from our confusion once we learn to see that confusion in action. So, what outer activities are we turning away from? That totally depends on your situation and your understanding, right? Like, if Fred is some person and Fred decides he's got a problem with drinking too much alcohol, he doesn't need 2 shots of vodka every night, and he decides actually it's not really serving his well-being, then when he sees that clearly from observing his experience and getting clearer about his experience, Fred might make a decision on his own. Maybe I don't need 2 shots of vodka every night. Maybe I don't need the vodka at all, perhaps. But that sort of decision about like what to engage in and what not to engage in outer life, it's entirely a product of seeing what works in our lives, what impedes our freedom. So there's common statements in Mahayana Buddhism that outward appearances, outward objects in life, that's not what binds us. What binds us is the way that we're relating to those objects and experiences, the way that we either grasp after them and want to hold on to things that aren't going to give us the satisfaction that we're hoping for, or we're constantly like pushing away with fear or violence the things that we think are threatening us, and we've got to keep them at bay. So it's this constant like reaching out futilely toward and futilely trying to hold on to and pushing away. That's that sort of reactivity toward our experience, both toward our inner experience and our outer experience. That's what's binding us, simply put, according to Buddhism. I'm putting all of this very simply, but it's not the experiences themselves. So there's in the Nyingma tradition, there's a very like healthy, robust, long-standing tradition of lay people practicing, meaning women and men with families or single people, et cetera, with jobs and everything. I mentioned Khenpo Khalsang, who's a monk, and I respect his whole life and what he exemplifies. And at the same time, um, I think it's fair to say the vast majority of people in the Nyingma tradition have never been monastics. They've always been lay people, and they've engaged with everyday life. They've earned livings, they've had families. And the teachings of this tradition are coming from that standpoint that there's no necessary obstacle to living our lives and being, productive and earning a living and so on and so forth. We want to give up the inner causes of our pain. So, uh, so for those who are interested, good food and sex is still on the table. Um, Last point. is that although we've been talking about this wish for our own freedom, when we learn the methods of how to really investigate our experience moment by moment as we're going through our lives, we investigate this in the course of daily lives because in different situations, different kinds of patternings come up, certain things come up with me when I'm at work with these people, and other things come up with me when I'm, on the sports field with those people or with this group of friends. And so we see all that, all those patternings, and where we're caught and where we're free, and we increase the freedom and we reduce where we're caught. And then we have formal sessions where we're setting aside time and we're doing like formal meditation where we're quieting down. We're not out talking and running around and at work. We're laying down or sitting, and we're deeply investigating inwardly in the body and mind. Either way, what we've been talking about is looking and trying to encourage our own freedom and not holding back on this well-wishing for ourselves. So the last quick point I want to make is once we start to see the patterns that bind us and how they're working, it's a pretty quick flip. It's a pretty quick step to the bodhisattva path, which is about caring for others. Because what we see is we get to the underlying patterning, and we start to see the underlying patterning is human, and it applies to everyone. And as we investigate our experience, this becomes very, very clear, right? So, David, an old friend who's on screen, right? He, may have certain, I'm just making something up because I think he won't mind. I may have certain like situations or, triggers that maybe stir up some sadness from a memory from the past. And he may have other kinds of stimuli or triggers that stir up some sadness for him, let's just say, from the past. But that's all superficial. What's deep down is there's a sense of a self. There's certain kinds of patterning going on in the mind. Sadness comes, and then my attention gets caught in the sadness, and I've lost my freedom at that moment. But what I start to see is it doesn't matter what David's particular prompts are that might lead him to feel a little sad and what mine are. What matters is we share the patterning. And so a deep empathy comes for everyone around us because the superficiality is the fact that, Julie was born in Michigan and George was born in Oregon. It's not so important, right? At one level, okay, fine, it is. But at a deeper level, it's not so important. So this bodhisattva wish of wanting to help others and seeing the inseparability between ourselves and others, the similarity, when we investigate our own experience to wish ourselves freedom, this switch then to seeing, oh, it's just like this for others, right? So I'll suggest one simple practice before I stop and just open for discussion, which is that when we find ourselves somehow disturbed, our peace has been disturbed at any point in our daily lives, we can notice what's going on. We can ask ourselves, what's going on? We can look inside. We can start to see, oh, is this a result of, some kind of unrealistic wanting? Is this a result of some sort of fear? What exactly is the disturbance? Is it anxiety? Is it loneliness? Start to get a feel into it. We can start to relax our body and ourself around it, not be afraid of whatever the disturbance is. But related to what I was just saying, we can then take the step of feeling what's going on, feeling that it hurts. It's not pleasant. It's not peaceful. And realizing this is how it is for everyone. Not to just be caught in our own situation, that I'm angry because so-and-so did blah, blah, blah just now. But instead to feel, oh, I'm angry. This really doesn't feel good. This is totally, I don't If I really have to feel into it, instead of like acting it out, if I actually have to feel into it, this is not pleasant to be angry. And then to take the further step of realizing, wow, this is how it feels for everyone when they're angry. Um, that immediately starts to build empathy, starts to build connection outside of just the narrow self. Okay, so that's like a movement from this wish for our own freedom to this wish for greater caring toward others. But we can work on it just through our own experience. When we're in some sort of distress, then we broaden it out. Ooh, I want to be free from this distress. We can learn methods of how to do that at Nyingma Institute. I don't have time to share those methods right now. But then we can broaden it to, ah, this is what it's like to be human. It's hard to be human. um, okay, so I want to encourage everybody, whatever you do, whatever sorts of things you study, that I hope that you can find greater joy and greater ease and give yourself the permission to pursue that wholeheartedly, to pursue that sort of freedom, that you can do it. And according to Buddhism, that's the meaning of our lives. So I'm going to thank you for your attention. I went too long, but I'm going to stop and open it up. And then when people need to leave, then just leave and take care. I put my email in the chat. So if you have, objections or questions to things I was bringing up and you want to email me, I'll get back to you. Give me a little time, but I'll get back to you when I'm able. So thoughts, reactions. Patricia, put in the chat a good question about this tendency to self-criticize. Yeah, although like I'm largely a historian, like a historian of religion and culture and so on. So I do think there's something to what you're saying, but I don't want to oversimplify it. But I would say, um, yeah, you don't find this, like if you actually study ancient Greco-Roman culture, you don't find this sort of like guilt, self-criticism, self-hatred. It really starts to come from mostly from certain strands of Western culture, like starting from the, um, you know, early centuries CE onward. Um, and yeah, I don't want to, paint any tradition too broadly, but I think you're on to something, at least part of it for sure. But questions, comments, reactions. If you've been practicing Buddhism, have you focused a lot on sending this deep love and caring and wanting your own well-being to yourself? Is that something that you've deeply been doing? And has that been easy if you've been doing that? Has it been a process or have you not been doing that? Is that something maybe to focus a little more on?
Well, I would just say that since Rinpoche's book came out on caring a few years ago, it's allowed me to access some inroads. There's some wonderful exercises, practices in that book. I've just find very, very helpful.
For sure. And I mentioned in the chat, I mentioned two sections of that book, right? And of course, I don't know, but it just based on everything I've been seeing, then that book came out, and it's like, oh wow, Tarthang Tulku, who's the founder of the Nyingma Institute, this highly trained teacher who was trained in Tibet with a traditional education before Tibet really changed with the Chinese invasion, and has been in America longer than any other Buddhist teacher has been in any Western country, and so knows the minds and the patternings of Westerners as deeply, as certainly any Buddhist teacher in the West, because he's been here in residence working with people from all sorts of Western countries for decades and decades. when he wrote that book, it seemed to me, he's directly addressing the sorts of issues that I was trying to speak to, right? This people not understanding that it's not only okay, it's absolutely vital to deeply care for ourselves as a foundation of the path. I would, on that note a little bit, I would say if you're familiar with some of the older books of Tarthang Tulku that are often taught at Nyingma Institute, a book, say, like Gesture of Balance that was written in 1977, Gesture of Balance. It's a classic meditation book, and it goes like step by step through various stages of the path. And if you look at it carefully, you'll see that in the early chapters, the emphasis from Tarthang Tulku, it's all experiential in that book. And the emphasis is on learning how to generate healing, nourishing, joyful, even blissful feeling, and saturating our body and mind with joyful, blissful feeling. Before he has any chapters about love or compassion, caring about others, before he has any chapters about seeing through the self and realizing this open nature of being, these higher understandings, earlier in the book, he's grounding readers in immersing themselves in deep feelings of nourishment, joy, bliss. So that is an experiential expression of what I was trying to talk about when I'm saying, caring about ourselves, right? Um, so you do definitely see it in those teachings. He recognized this long, long ago that we need this emphasis. Other kinds of reactions, comments, questions? If people have been practicing and they just here and among a supportive group, they want to bring up something else related to practice that they've been into, then that's fine too.
Well, hi everyone. I'm one of the new people here in your speaking. Elon, thank you for welcoming me. I've been doing metta meditations and for quite a while, but more frequently now in a mindfulness meditation class taught by Joanna Dwyer, who's also here tonight. And it is becoming progressively easier to give myself the peace and the ease and the joy and the health and the and all of the wonderful things that we want to give everyone else, and starting with myself. And at first, several years ago, it was uncomfortable, and now it feels more natural. But your speaking today opened up some more ideas for deepening that. So thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. And I'm happy to hear that. And
Yeah.
That's you bring up a point that's instructive, I think, for all of us, is that when we're first, say, sending kind feelings to ourselves, accepting feelings, loving feelings of, wow, may I really be happy? May I really find freedom? Even if I don't know exactly how to find freedom, but just having the wish, just saying the wish is not only okay, it's entirely wholesome, right? We don't, again, sometimes we read Buddhist books and we say, oh, Buddhism says you're not supposed to have desires. That's totally like nonsense, right? A key part of Buddhism is having strong positive aspirations, strong positive wishes. So, like, even to have this wish, I really want to be happy. I really want to be free. And to wholeheartedly give ourselves over to that wish, even though it's like, I realize right now, I don't really know exactly what lasting happiness or total freedom would consist of. I don't know exactly. I have some inklings, let's say, like we all do, right? Maybe we don't know exactly like how to get toward perfect freedom. Again, maybe we have some starting points, but we can still give ourselves over to that wish wholeheartedly, and like let it be a light that fills us. But what Barbara was saying about how often we'll first do a practice, like, may I be happy, may I be truly happy, may I have peace. All kinds of resistances come up. And what we start to see are sticking points where we're attached to this or that self-image or this or that judgment or objection. And as we see the sticking points again and again, we can start to disentangle our attachment, our awareness, or our attention. We can disentangle it from those sticking points as we bump into them again and again, right? So seeing the sticking points rather than causing frustration, that's the way toward greater freedom. We see them, we feel the sticking points, and then we release, because where there's a sticking point, it means somehow we're attached. Somehow our sense of self is attached to some sort of negative judgment or negative self-image. And so, where we hit the wall, that's where there's some sort of hidden attachment. And when we run into the wall enough, we start to shine a light on what that wall is. Then we see through the wall and the wall's not there. Right? And that's what I was hearing from Barbara with repeated. So that's fabulous with repeated practice. Any other comments, questions? So have a great night, everyone. Take good care.
Thank you so much, Elon. This was really wonderful. Very thought-provoking and feeling.
Pleasure.